Chapter 11. Nancy makes a visit. On the evening after the Bumbles' little business meeting, Mr. Bill Sikes, waking from a sleep, called out to ask the time. The room he was lying in was very small and dirty. It was a different room from the one he had occupied before the Chertsey expedition, but it was in the same poor part of London. There were so few possessions or comforts in the room that it was clear Mr. Sikes had met hard times. He himself was thin and pale from illness, and was lying on the bed, wrapped in an old coat. The white dog lay on the floor next to him. Seated by the window was Nancy, repairing Sikes' old jacket. She too was thin and pale. At Sikes' voice, she raised her head from her work. "Not long past 7, she said. "How do you feel now, Bill?"
"As weak as water. Help me get up, will you?"
As Nancy helped him out of bed, Sikes swore and cursed at her clumsiness. Illness had not improved his temper. "You wouldn't speak like that if you knew how kindly I'd nursed you these last few days," said Nancy. "So many nights I've looked after you." She sat down in a chair, exhausted.
"Get up," shouted Sikes. "What's wrong with you?"
But Nancy was unable to get up. Her head fell back against the chair and she fainted. Sikes swore and cursed again, but Nancy remained unconscious. "What's the matter here?" asked a voice from the door, and Fagin, followed by the artful Dodger and Charlie Bates, entered the room. When they saw Nancy, they hurried to help her. Charlie rubbed her hands, and the Dodger gave her a drink from the bottle he carried. Gradually, Nancy recovered her senses. Sikes then turned to Fagin.
"What are you here for?" he asked roughly. "You haven't been here for weeks, all the time I was ill. I haven't 2 coins to rub together. Why didn't you help me? You treat me worse than a dog."
"Don't be bad-tempered, my dear," said Fagin calmly. "I haven't forgotten you, Bill."
"Well, what about some money, then? I've done enough work for you recently. What about some money?"
"I haven't a single coin with me, my dear," said Fagin.
"Then go and get some. You've got lots at home." "No, I don't trust you. Nancy can go back with you to your house and fetch some money. I'll stay here and sleep." After a good deal of arguing, Fagin managed to reduce the amount Sikes was demanding from £5 to £3. He went back to his house with Nancy and the boys. When they were inside, Fagin told the girl, "I'll just go upstairs and fetch the cash for Bill, my dear. There's little money in this business, Nancy, little money and no thanks, but I'm fond of seeing the young people around me." Suddenly there was a man's voice at the front door. As soon as Nancy heard it, she sat up in her chair. "That's the man I was expecting earlier," said Fagin. "Don't worry, he'll only be 10 minutes. The man entered the room. It was Monks. When he saw Nancy, he moved back, as if he had expected no one but Fagin. "It's all right, only one of my young people," Fagin said to him. "Did you see him?" "Yes," answered Monks. "Any news?" "Good news," said Monks with a smile. "Let me have a word with you." He and Fagin went upstairs to talk privately. As soon as they had left the room, Nancy took off her shoes and crept silently up the stairs to listen in the passage, as she had done once before. She was gone for a quarter of an hour. Then, like a ghost, she reappeared in the downstairs room and sat down. Immediately afterwards, the 2 men descended the stairs. "How pale you are, Nancy," said Fagin, once Monks had left the house. "What have you been doing to yourself?" "Nothing, except waiting here for you too long," she answered.
turning her face away from him. "Now, where's the money for Bill?" With a sigh for every piece of money, Fagin put the agreed amount into her hand. When Nancy was out in the street again, she sat down on a doorstep and for a few minutes seemed unable to move. Then she started running wildly through the streets, and when she was exhausted she stopped and burst into tears. This strange mood seemed to leave her then, and she turned and hurried back to Sykes' house. At first, when she returned, Sykes noticed nothing unusual about her. Fagin, with his sharp, suspicious eyes, would have noticed something at once. But as night came, the girl's nervous excitement increased, and even Sykes was alarmed by the paleness in her cheeks and the fire in her eye. He lay in bed, drinking hot gin and water and staring at her.
"You look like a corpse that's come back to life again. What's the matter with you tonight?"
"Nothing. Why are you staring at me so hard?"
"Either you've caught the fever yourself, or... No, you're not going to... You wouldn't do that."
"Do what?" asked the girl.
"There's not a girl alive as loyal as you. If you weren't, I'd have cut your throat months ago. No, you must have the fever coming on, that's it. Now, give me some of my medicine."
Nancy quickly poured out his medicine with her back to him. He took it, and after turning restlessly for some time, he eventually fell into a deep, heavy sleep. "The drug's taken effect at last," Nancy said to herself as she rose from her position beside the bed. "I hope I'm not too late." Quickly, she put on her coat and hat, looking round fearfully as if she expected at any moment to feel Sykes' heavy hand on her shoulder. She kissed the robber's lips softly, then ran from the house without a sound. She hurried in the direction of West London, pushing past people on the pavement and running across crowded streets without looking. "The woman is mad," said the people, turning to look at her as she rushed past them. She came to a wealthier part of the town, where the streets were quieter, and before long she had reached her destination. It was a family hotel in a quiet street near Hyde Park. The clock struck 11 as she entered. The man at the desk looked at her and asked, "What do you want here?" "I want to see Miss Maylie." The man looked at the young woman with strong disapproval. "She won't want to see someone like you. Come on, get out." "Let me see her, or two of you will have to throw me out," said Nancy violently. The man looked at her again and decided it would be easier to do as she asked. He led her upstairs to Rose's room. Nancy entered with a brave face, but with fear in her heart. "Please sit down and tell me why you wish to see me," said Rose Maylie, looking with some surprise at this poor, rough girl from the streets. Rose's manner was so kind and sincere, and so unexpected, that Nancy burst into tears. When she had recovered a little, she asked, "Is the door shut?" "Yes," answered Rose a little nervously. "But why?" "Because I am about to put my life and the lives of others in your hands. I am the girl that kidnapped little Oliver and took him back to old Fagin's house on the night Oliver was going to the bookseller." "You?" said Rose. "Yes, it was me. I am that wicked creature you have heard about. I've no friends except thieves and robbers. I've lived on the street since I was a child, cold, hungry, among people who are always drunk and fighting, and that's where I'll die too." "I pity you," said Rose in a broken voice. "But I'll tell you why I'm here. Do you know a man called Monks?" "No," answered Rose. "He knows you. I heard him tell Fagin that you were at this hotel. Maybe he's changed his name. Soon after Oliver was put into your house on the night of the robbery, I listened in secret to a conversation between Monks and Fagin in the dark. And I heard Monks say that he'd seen Oliver in the street and that he knew at once Oliver was the child he was looking for, although I couldn't hear why. Monks then agreed to pay Fagin some money if he could find Oliver again, and more money if he could turn the poor boy into a thief. "Why?" asked Rose. "He saw my shadow on the wall as I listened and I had to escape. I didn't see him again until last night." "And what happened then?" "I listened at the door again, and I heard Monks say this: 'So the only proof of the boy's identity is at the bottom of the river, and the old woman who received it is dead.' He and Fagin laughed. Then Monks said that he had all Oliver's money safely now, but how funny it would be if the boy went to prison for stealing after his father's unfair will." "What is all this?" asked Rose. "It's the truth, lady. Then Monks said he couldn't have Oliver killed because suspicion would point to himself, but he'd try for the rest of his life to harm the boy if he could. Then Monks laughed again about the money Oliver should have got from his father's will. 'My young brother Oliver will never see that money,' he said." "His brother?" exclaimed Rose. "Those were his words," said Nancy, looking round uneasily, as if she still expected to see Sikes. "And then he talked about how amazed you would be if you knew who Oliver really was." "And this man was serious?" "His voice was full of anger and hatred. I know many people who do worse things, but I'd rather listen to all of them than to this man Monks. But I must get back now, or people will wonder where I've been." "Back? How can you go back to such a life?" asked Rose. "You've told me all this. Now I can help you by letting you stay somewhere safe." "No. Perhaps it's hard for you to believe, but there's one man, the most dangerous of them all, that I can never leave. You're the first person who's ever spoken to me so kindly, but it's too late." "It's never too late." "It is," cried the girl. "I can't leave him now. And if I tell anyone about this man, he'll die." "But how can I find you again when we want to investigate this mystery further?" "I'll meet you secretly, if you promise not to watch or follow me," said Nancy. "And if you promise just one more thing, not to do anything to hurt the man I can never leave." "I promise." "Every Sunday night, between 11 and 12, I will walk on London Bridge if I am alive. Meet me there if you want more information." As Nancy said these words, she left the room and ran down the stairs and out into the street once more. Rose was left alone, her thoughts in great confusion, as she wondered desperately what to do and who to ask for advice. The next morning, Oliver, who had been out walking, ran into Rose's room at the hotel. He was breathless with excitement. "I can't believe what I've seen. Now you'll all know that I've told you the truth," he shouted. "I know you've always told us the truth, but what are you talking about?" asked Rose. "I've seen Mr. Brownlow, the kind man who was so good to me." "Where?" "Going into a house," said Oliver, crying with joy. "I've got the address here." "Quick," said Rose, "call a coach. I'll take you there immediately." The idea came to Rose that perhaps Mr. Brownlow would advise her. She had been afraid to tell Nancy's story to Dr. Losberne, since the good doctor was very excitable and often acted with more enthusiasm than wisdom. In less than 5 minutes they were in the coach on their way to the address. Rose went in first to talk to Mr. Brownlow alone. She was taken into his study, and polite greetings were exchanged. When they were seated again, Rose said, "This will surprise you very much, but you were once very kind to a dear friend of mine, and I'm sure you will be interested to hear news of him."
"Really? May I ask you his name?"
"Oliver Twist." Mr. Brownlow said nothing for a few seconds, but simply stared at Rose. Finally he moved his chair nearer to her and said with great feeling, "I once thought that he was a liar and a thief. If you have evidence to show me I was wrong, please tell me at once." "I know him to be a child with a warm heart," said Rose, "and despite the hardships of his life, he's a better person than almost anyone I know."
"I looked for him everywhere," said Mr. Brownlow, "but I could never find him. I could never quite believe that he really did intend to rob me."
Rose told him everything that had happened to Oliver since then. She finished by saying, "And his only sorrow for some months has been that he could not find you, his former friend."
"Thank God," said Mr. Brownlow. "This is great happiness to me. Great happiness. But why haven't you brought him with you, Miss Maylie?"
"He's waiting in a coach at the door," replied Rose. Mr. Brownlow hurried out of the room, down the stairs, and into the coach without another word. In a minute he had returned with Oliver.
"How well he looks," he said. "New clothes, the same sweet face, but not so pale. The same eyes, but not so sad."
They talked with great joy for some time. Then Mr. Brownlow sent for Mrs. Bedwin, the old housekeeper. She came in quietly and waited for her orders.
"You get blinder every day," said Mr. Brownlow impatiently.
"People's eyes at my time of life don't improve with age," replied the old lady.
"Then put on your glasses."
As she searched for them in her pocket, Oliver could not wait any longer and ran into her arms.
"Dear God," she said, "it's my innocent boy."
"My dear old nurse," cried Oliver.
"I knew he would come back," said the old lady, holding him in her arms.
"How well he's dressed! How well he looks again!" She laughed and cried at the same time, and could not let Oliver go. While Oliver talked to Mrs. Bedwin, Rose asked Mr. Brownlow if she could speak to him privately. He led her into another room, and there listened, with a good deal of amazement, to Rose's account of her extraordinary conversation with Nancy. Between them, they decided that Mrs. Maylie and Dr. Losberne should be told, and that Mr. Brownlow would come to the hotel that evening for a discussion. For the moment, nothing would be said to Oliver himself. That evening at the hotel, Oliver's 4 friends met as arranged. Dr. Losberne, of course, was full of immediate plans to rush round London, arresting all the gang and hanging them at once. Mr. Brownlow, fortunately, was able to persuade him to abandon this wild idea.
"Then what's to be done?"
cried the doctor impatiently.
"First," said Mr. Brownlow calmly, "we must discover who Oliver's parents were. Then, if this girl's story is true, we must regain the inheritance that should have been his."
"Yes, yes," said the doctor, nodding in agreement. "But how shall we achieve these aims?"
"We must find this man Monks," said Mr. Brownlow. "Nancy will not betray the man who is special to her, but she will surely agree to tell us how or where to find Monks. Then we must find a way to force Monks to talk. We must be both cautious and clever. After all, we have no proof against him, and if we cannot make him talk, this mystery will never be solved. But we'll have to wait 5 days until Sunday before we can meet Nancy on London Bridge. Until then, we can do nothing."
Chapter 12. Nancy keeps an appointment.
On exactly the same night as Nancy had met Rose Maylie, two people from Oliver's hometown were making their way towards London. Their progress was slow, since they travelled on foot, and in addition the girl was carrying a heavy bag on her back. The young man carried nothing. From time to time he turned to shout at the girl behind him. "Hurry up! What a lazy creature you are, Charlotte! I'll come and give you a kick if you don't move faster." The young man was Noah Claypole, who had made Oliver's life so miserable at Mr. Sowerberry's house. He was now taller and uglier, but otherwise little changed. He and Charlotte had grown tired of the undertaking business and had set off to London to start a new life, with all the money from Mr. Sowerberry's shop in their pockets. Eventually they entered London, and Noah began to look for a quiet, cheap pub where they could spend the night. Charlotte followed obediently at his heels as they walked through a district of narrow, dirty streets. At last Noah found a pub that he thought was suitable. It was dark and dirty, with a few rough-looking men in the bar. They entered and asked for a room for the night and a meal of cold meat and beer, which they ate in the bar. The beer made Noah talkative, and he began to boast. "So it's no more coffins for us, my girl. We can do better than just robbing Mr. Sowerberry. In London there are pockets, houses, coaches, even banks." "I like the sound of it, Noah, but how are we going to do all this?" asked Charlotte. "We can meet people who know about these things. I'd like to be the leader of some gang if there's a good profit to be made in that kind of work." Noah felt very pleased with himself and looked forward to an easy life of crime in the capital. They talked about their plans for a few minutes. Then a stranger, who had been sitting unseen round the corner, came up to them. The stranger was Fagin. He greeted them in a very friendly and cheerful way, sat down with them, and immediately ordered more beer for Noah. "That's good beer," said Noah, already a little drunk. He thanked the stranger for the drink. "Expensive too," said Fagin. "If you drink that every day, my dear, you'll need to empty pockets, houses, coaches, even banks." When he heard his own words repeated, Noah went pale with terror. The stranger must have heard everything, even how they had robbed Mr. Sowerberry. "Don't worry," laughed Fagin, pulling his chair closer. "You're lucky it was only me who heard you." "I didn't take it," said Noah quickly. "It was the woman who did it." "It doesn't matter who did it, my dear," replied Fagin, looking quickly at Charlotte, "because I'm in that business myself, and the people in my house as well. I can introduce you to the right people if you're interested. You both look like good workers." Charlotte and Noah felt a mixture of fear and pleasure. "What would you want me to do?" asked Noah. "Something light, if possible," he added. "What about spying on people?" asked Fagin. "Or robbing young children who are going shopping for their mothers? That's light work and easy." Noah laughed. "That sounds like just the thing for me. And what will I earn for this work?" "You can live free in my house and give me half of what you earn." After further discussion, and the transfer of Mr. Sowerberry's money from Noah's pocket to Fagin's, agreement was reached. The next day, Noah and Charlotte went to live in Fagin's house and began to be instructed in their new profession. Although training and experience had made Nancy an expert liar, she could not completely hide the fear in her mind. She knew she had taken an enormous risk in going to see Rose Maylie. If Fagin or Sykes ever found out. But she pushed these fears away. She was determined to keep her promise to Rose Maylie and meet her as arranged. On the first Sunday night after her meeting with Rose, she was in Sykes' room when the clock struck 11. Fagin was there too, discussing some business with Sikes. Nancy stood up and put on her coat. Sikes watched her, surprised. "Nancy, where are you going at this time of night?" "Not far." "What kind of answer is that? Where are you going?" "I don't know," replied the girl. "Then I do. Nowhere. Sit down." "I'm not well. I want a breath of air." Sikes got up and locked the door. "Let me go," said the girl with great force. "Just for 1 hour. Let me go." Sikes seized her arms roughly. "The girl's gone mad." Nancy fought wildly, and Sikes had to hold her down in a chair. She continued to scream and fight until midnight, when, exhausted and tearful, she stopped struggling. She went into another room and threw herself on a bed. "She's a strange girl," Sikes said to Fagin, shaking his head. "Why did she suddenly decide to go out tonight? I thought that after all these years I'd finally tamed her. She must be ill. Perhaps she's still got a bit of fever." "That must be it," said Fagin, nodding thoughtfully. As he walked home, Fagin's eyes were sharp with suspicion. He had suspected for a while that Nancy had become tired of Bill Sikes' brutality and violence, and that she had found a new friend to take his place. Her manner was different. She often left home alone, and she seemed less interested in the gang. And tonight, her desperate impatience to go out at a particular hour. He was certain he was right. He began to make plans. First, he wanted to know who Nancy's new friend was. He could make him a valuable new member of the gang, with Nancy as his assistant. But there was another, darker reason. Fagin, too, had become tired of Sikes. Sikes knew too much, too many dangerous secrets about Fagin himself. Fagin distrusted everybody, but he hated and distrusted Sikes most of all. It would be very convenient if Sikes could be removed. With a little persuasion, Fagin thought, perhaps the girl would poison Sikes. Suddenly his eyes narrowed in delight. Yes, first I must have her watched and find out who her new man is. Then I shall threaten to tell Sikes everything. She knows that neither she nor her new man will ever be safe from Sikes' violent jealousy. She will have no choice except to do as I ask her. And then, once the murder is done, she will be in my power forever. Early next morning, Fagin called the newest member of his gang. Noah was doing very well. He had already brought home quite a lot of money. He had found that robbing small children was indeed light, easy work, and he was proud of his success. I have another job for you now, Fagin told him. It needs great care and secrecy. I want you to follow a woman. I want to know where she goes, who she sees, and, if possible, what she says. I will pay you £1 for this information. Noah's eyes were wide with greed. I'm the right man for this job. Who is she? One of us. What? You don't trust her, then? Exactly so, my dear. Exactly so, smiled Fagin. The following Sunday, soon after 11 o'clock, a woman walked quickly through the dark streets towards London Bridge. A mist hung over the river, and the buildings on the far bank could hardly be seen. A man followed some distance behind her, keeping to the darkest shadows. It was a cold, damp night, and there were very few people on the streets at this late hour. When the woman reached the centre of the bridge, she stopped and looked around anxiously. The man following her stopped too. The heavy bell of St. Paul's Cathedral rang out, announcing the death of another day. Just as it finished, A grey-haired man and a young woman got out of a coach and walked across the bridge. They met the woman, who took them down some steps leading to the river bank. They stood in deep shadow by the wall of the bridge. The man hurried down some other steps, crept up to the corner of the wall, and listened. Nancy spoke first. "I'm so frightened tonight, I can hardly breathe." "Frightened of what?" asked Mr. Brownlow. He seemed to pity her. "I wish I knew. Horrible thoughts of death and blood have been with me all day. I don't know why." "Speak to her kindly," said Rose to Mr. Brownlow. "Poor girl, she seems to need it." "I couldn't come last Sunday," continued the girl. "I was kept in by force. But tonight he'll be out all night until daylight. Now, before I tell you anything else, I must tell you that I don't want Fagin or any of the other members of the gang to be handed to the police." "Why not?" "Because I couldn't betray them. They've been loyal to me, and I'll stay loyal to them." "Then just tell us how we can get Monks, and I promise none of your friends will be harmed," said Mr. Brownlow. "And Monks will never know how you found out about him?" she asked. "We promise," said Rose gently. Nancy then told them, in so low a voice that the listener round the corner could hardly hear her, where Monks often went for a drink and what he looked like. She finished by saying, "On his throat, high up, there is a bright red mark?" asked Mr. Brownlow. "Do you know him?" asked Nancy in surprise. "I think I do," Mr. Brownlow murmured to himself. "It must be him." Then more loudly he said to Nancy, "Thank you for everything you've told us. But now, how can you go back to these people? Come with us now, tonight. We can arrange for you to be hidden from them all forever if you want us to." The girl shook her head. "I'm chained to him, bad as they are. I've gone too far to change my life now." She looked nervously over her shoulder. "I can feel those dreadful terrors again, visions of blood and death. I must go home." Mr. Brownlow and Rose could not persuade her to change her mind. Sadly, they turned to leave, and when they had gone, Nancy fell to the ground in a storm of tears. Meanwhile, Noah Claypole, amazed by all that he had heard, crept up the steps and ran for Fagin's house as fast as his legs could carry him. Some hours later, nearly 2 hours before dawn, Noah lay asleep in Fagin's house, but Fagin sat silently by a dead fire, staring at the flame of a candle on the table beside him. With his pale, wrinkled face and his red, staring eyes, he looked like a devil out of hell. Hatred ran like poison through his every thought. Hatred for the girl who had dared to talk to strangers, who had ruined his plan to get rid of Sykes. He did not believe her promise not to betray him, and he feared that he would now be caught and hung. Just before dawn, Sykes entered the room, carrying a bundle which contained the results of his night's work. Fagin took what Sykes gave him, then stared at the robber for a long time without speaking. "Why are you looking at me like that?" asked Sykes, uneasy at the old man's strange expression. Fagin raised his hand, but his passion was so great that he could not speak. "Say something, will you?" shouted Sykes, placing his huge hand on Fagin's collar and shaking him in his anger and fear. "Open your mouth and say what you've got to say." Eventually, Fagin found his voice. "Bill, what would you do if one of the gang went out at night and told someone all about us and what we'd done? What would you do to him?" "I'd smash his head into little pieces," said the robber, swearing violently. "And what if it was me? who knows so much about all of us, and could put us all in prison and get us all hanged," whispered Fagin, his eyes flashing with hate. "I'd beat your brains out in public. Even in the law court I'd run over and kill you with my bare hands," said Sikes, showing his teeth in his anger. "I don't care who it was, that's what I'd do." Fagin woke Noah. "Tell Bill what you told me, what you saw, what she did. Tell him." Noah rubbed the sleep from his eyes and told Sikes everything. His face white with passion, Sikes listened to the end, then, swearing furiously, he rushed from the room and down the stairs. "Bill," Fagin called after him, "you won't be too violent." Sikes made no reply, but pulling open the door, ran out into the silent streets. He did not turn his head to right or left, but looked straight in front of him with wild determination. He ran at great speed, his eyes on fire, his teeth tight together, and did not pause until he reached his own door. He ran up to his room, entered, and locked the door, put a table against it, then woke Nancy. "Bill," she said, pleased to see him. But when she saw his expression, the colour went out of her face. "What's the matter?" she said in alarm. "You know what?" Sikes took out his gun, but realizing even in his madness that a shot might be heard, he beat her twice across the face with it, as hard as he could. She fell, with a low cry of pain and terror, almost blinded by the blood that flowed from the cut on her forehead. The murderer staggered to a corner, seized a heavy stick, and struck her down. Chapter 13. The End of the Gang. The sun burst upon the crowded city in all its brightness. It lit up every corner of London, the great houses of the rich and the miserable homes of the poor. It shone everywhere, even into the room where the murdered woman lay. The horror of that scene was even more dreadful in the clear morning light. Sikes sat there, unable to move, looking at the body. He had thrown the blood-covered stick into the fire, then washed himself and his clothes. He had cut out the bits of his clothes that were stained and burnt them too, but there were still bloodstains all over the floor. Even the dog's feet were bloody. Finally, he forced himself to leave the room, pulling the dog out with him and locking the door behind him. He walked rapidly north, towards Highgate, then on to Hampstead. On the open land of Hampstead Heath, away from people and houses, he found a place in a field where he could sleep without being disturbed. But before long, he was up again and running. This time he ran back towards London for a while. Then he turned and went north again, sometimes walking, sometimes running, with no clear purpose in his mind. Eventually he felt hungry, and changed direction towards Hendon, a quiet place away from the crowds, where he could buy food. But even the children and chickens there seemed to look at him with suspicion. So he turned back towards Hampstead Heath again, without having eaten, uncertain where to go. At last he turned north again, his dog still running at his heels, and set off to a village just outside London. He stopped at a small, quiet pub and bought a meal, then went on again. It was now dark, and as he continued walking, he felt as if Nancy were following him, her shadow on the road, her last low cry in the wind. If he stopped, the ghostly figure did the same. If he ran, it ran too, moving stiffly like a corpse. Sometimes he turned, determined to drive the ghost away, but his blood ran cold with terror.
Every time he turned, the ghost turned too, and was still behind him. Finally, he found another field where he could hide. He lay down, unable to sleep, his mind filled with visions of the dead girl. Her wide, dead eyes stared at him, watching him through a curtain of blood. Suddenly, he heard shouting in the distance. He jumped to his feet and saw that the sky seemed on fire. Sheets of flame shot into the air, driving clouds of smoke in his direction. He heard an alarm bell and more shouts of fire. Running with his dog across the fields, he joined the crowds of men and women fighting the fire. He could forget his own terror in this new danger, and he worked all night with the crowd, shouting, running, and working together to stop the flames destroying more buildings. In the morning, the mad excitement was over, and the dreadful memory of his crime returned, more terrifying than ever. In desperation, he decided to go back to London. "At least there'll be somebody I can speak to," he thought to himself. "And it's a better hiding place than out here in the country. I'll hide there for a week, get some money out of Fagin, then escape to France." Suddenly he remembered the dog. People would be looking for his dog as well as himself. He decided to drown the animal. But the dog smelt the man's fear and turned and ran away from him faster than it had ever run in its life. "You have a choice, Mr. Monks," said Mr. Brownlow. "You have been kidnapped and brought here to my house. You can either tell me what I want to know, or I'll have you arrested, instantly, for fraud and robbery. It's your choice, and you must decide now, at once." Monks hesitated and looked at the old man, but Mr. Brownlow's expression was so serious and determined that the younger man realized it was pointless to protest. "I didn't expect this treatment from my father's oldest friend," said Monks angrily, sitting down with a frown on his face. "Yes, I was your father's oldest friend," said Mr. Brownlow. "And I know all about you, how your father, while still a boy, was forced by his family into an unhappy marriage with an older woman, and how you were the result of that marriage. I also know that your parents separated, hating each other by the end. Well, what's so important about that?" "When they'd been separated for 10 years, said Mr. Brownlow, your father met another family. There were 2 daughters, one 19 years old, and the other only 2 or 3. Your father became engaged to the older daughter. At this point, one of his rich relations died and left him a lot of money in his will. Your father had to travel to Italy to receive his inheritance, and while there, he became ill and died. Your mother, who was living with you in Paris, immediately rushed to Italy when she heard the news. As your father had made no will of his own, all the relations' money came to you and her." Monks listened with close attention, biting his lip and staring at the floor. "Before your father went to receive that money, he came to see me," continued Mr. Brownlow slowly, his eyes fixed on Monk's face. "I never heard that before," said Monks, looking up suddenly, a suspicious expression on his face. "He left me a picture of the poor girl he wanted to marry. He talked wildly about shame and guilt, and how he would give part of the money he'd inherited to his wife and to you, and use the rest to escape from England with the girl he loved. He refused to tell me any more details." Monks breathed more easily, and even smiled. "But," said Mr. Brownlow, pulling his chair nearer to the other man, "by chance I was able to rescue your brother Oliver from a life of misery and—" "What?" cried Monks. Mr. Brownlow continued without a pause. "And when he was recovering from his sickness here in my house, I noticed how similar he looked to the girl's face in the picture. But he was taken away before I could discover his history, as you know very well."
"You can't prove anything," said Monks. "I can. I heard that you were in the West Indies. I went there to try and find you, to see if you knew anything about Oliver, but you'd already left. I returned to London and was unable to find you until 2 hours ago." "And now what? You can't prove that Oliver's my brother." Monks smiled unpleasantly. "I couldn't before," said Mr. Brownlow, standing up, "but now I can. There was a will, but your mother destroyed it. This will mentioned a child that would be born later. This was Oliver, the child you met later by accident. You noticed his resemblance to your father, and you became suspicious. You then went back to his birthplace, found proof of his birth and the fact that he's your half-brother, and destroyed that proof." Monks sat in silence, his eyes filled with fear. "Yes," continued Mr. Brownlow fiercely, "shadows on the wall have caught your whispers with Fagin and brought them to my ear. For the sake of that innocent child whom you wanted to destroy. And now murder has been done, and you are as guilty of that as if you had struck the blow yourself." "No, no," said Monks quickly. "I knew nothing of that, nothing at all." He was silent for a while, realizing how much was known about him. Hatred and fear fought inside him, but he was a coward at heart. At last, seeing no escape, he raised his head. "I will admit everything in front of witnesses if necessary." Mr. Brownlow nodded coldly. "I will prepare a document for you to sign. You must give Oliver what is really his, and then you can go where you please." At that moment, Dr. Losberne rushed into the room. "The murderer will be taken tonight. His dog's been found." "And Fagin?" asked Mr. Brownlow. "They're sure of him. They may have him already." Mr. Brownlow turned back to Monks. "Have you made up your mind?" "Yes," replied Monks. "And you promise it'll remain a secret? No police or charges of fraud against me?" "Yes," said Mr. Brownlow. "You have my promise. For now you must remain here, locked in this room. I will come for you tomorrow evening and take you to sign a confession in front of witnesses." Mr. Brownlow then left the room with the doctor, and they eagerly discussed the news of the hunt for the criminals. "My blood boils with anger," said Mr. Brownlow. "This poor murdered girl must be revenged. You stay here and guard Monks. I'll go out and get the latest news." The two men parted, each in a fever of excitement. Down by the River Thames was a district called Rotherhithe, one of the dirtiest and roughest places in London. The houses next to the river had no owners. They were broken down and ruined, but could be defended against attack. In an upper room of one of these houses were 3 members of Fagin's gang. "When was Fagin taken, then?" asked the man called Toby. 2 o'clock this afternoon. Charlie and I escaped up the chimney, but Noah was caught. Bet went to see Nancy, and when she saw the body, she started screaming and wouldn't stop. She's been taken to hospital." "What's happened to Charlie Bates?" "He'll come here when it's dark. It's too dangerous now." "We're in trouble," said Toby. "Fagin's going to hang, that's certain." "You should have seen him when he was caught," said another robber. "The police carried him through the crowd, while all the people jumped at him, screaming and trying to attack him." Suddenly, Sykes' dog ran into the room. All the robbers rushed out immediately to look for Sykes, but there was no sign of him. They returned to the upstairs room. "I hope he's not coming here," said Toby. "The dog's come a long way," said another man, "covered in mud and tired out." They sat there in silence, wondering where Sykes was. It was already dark when they heard a sudden, hurried knock at the door downstairs. Toby went to the window to look down, then pulled his head back, his face pale with fear. There was no need to tell the others who it was. "We must let him in," said Toby, although none of them wanted to see him. Toby went down to the door and returned, followed by Sikes. White-faced, with a 3-day-old beard, hollow cheeks and staring eyes, Sikes looked like a ghost. No one said a word. "Nothing to say to me?" Sikes asked. The only answer was a low shout of many voices from outside in the distance, coming closer. Lights appeared. Looking out, Sikes saw a stream of people crossing the bridge towards them. Then there was a loud knocking on the door and more shouts from the crowd. "The doors are made of metal and they're locked and chained," said Toby. The 3 robbers watched Sikes nervously, as if he were a wild animal. "Bring a ladder," shouted some of the crowd below. "Give me a rope, quick," Sikes said to the others. "I'll go the other way, climb down the back and escape over the river. Get me a rope, now, or I'll do 3 more murders." A minute later, Sikes appeared on the roof, and the shouts from the crowd below swelled to a great roar. Then the front door was smashed down and people streamed into the house. Sikes quickly tied the rope around the chimney, then began to tie the other end around himself, ready to lower himself to the ground behind the house. But just as he put the rope over his head, he screamed in terror and threw his arms above his head. He staggered back, slipped, and fell over the edge of the roof. As he fell, the rope tightened around his neck with a horrible jerk. In a second, the murderer was dead, and there he hung, his body swinging gently from side to side. The dog, which had followed its master onto the roof, jumped down towards the lifeless body, missed, and fell dead on the stones below. Chapter 14. The End of the Mystery. The next day, Oliver travelled with Mr. Brownlow, Dr. Losberne, Mrs. Maylie, and Rose back to his birthplace. He had been told a little of his history, and knew that there would be more explanations at the end of this journey. He was anxious and uncertain, wondering what he would hear. But towards the end of the journey, he began to recognize familiar places, and in great excitement pointed them out to Rose. There was the path he had taken when he had run away. There, across the fields, was the baby farm. Then, as they drove into the town, he saw the house of Mr. Sowerberry the undertaker, and the workhouse that had been his prison. They stopped at the biggest hotel in the town, and went into their rooms. During dinner, Mr. Brownlow stayed in a separate room, and the older members of the group went in and out with serious faces. Mrs. Maylie came back with her eyes red from crying. All this made Rose and Oliver, who had not been told any new secrets, very nervous and uncomfortable. At 9 o'clock, Dr. Losberne and Mr. Brownlow brought Monks into the room. Oliver was very surprised. This was the same man he had bumped into once outside a pub and seen another time with Fagin, looking in at him through the window of the country cottage. Oliver was told that Monks was his half-brother, and the boy stared at him in shock and amazement. Monks looked back at him with hatred. "We have the whole story here in these papers," said Mr. Brownlow, putting them on the table. "All we need now is for you to sign them, Monks, and to tell Oliver what happened." Monks started hesitantly. "My father had arrived in Italy to collect the money he had inherited when suddenly he fell ill. When he died, we found 2 papers in his desk. One was a letter to his girl. The other was a will." "What was the letter?" asked Mr. Brownlow. "It was written when he was ill, telling the girl how ashamed he was that she was pregnant. He asked her not to remember him as a bad man, but as someone who had made a mistake.
He reminded her of the day he'd given her the locket and ring. Oliver's tears fell fast as he listened to the story of his father. "And what about the will?" asked Mr. Brownlow. Monks was silent. "The will," continued Mr. Brownlow, speaking for him, "was in the same spirit as the letter. He talked of the misery of his marriage to his wife and the evil character of you, Monks, his only son, who had been brought up by your mother to hate him. He left you and your mother an annual income of £800. The rest of his property he left to his girl Agnes and to their child, if it were born alive, and if it showed itself to be of a good, kind character. The money would only go to you, Monks, as the older son, if the younger turned out to be as evil as you." "My mother," said Monks, "burnt this will and never sent the letter. The girl Agnes left her home in secret so that her pregnancy would not bring shame on her family. I swore to my mother, when she was dying, that if I ever found my half-brother, I would do him all the harm I could. He would feel my hatred like a whip on his back. I paid Fagin to trap Oliver into a life of crime. But then he escaped, and that stupid, interfering girl, Nancy, to you. If I'd had the chance, I would have finished what I'd begun." Monks stared at Oliver, and his lips moved in a silent curse. "And the locket and ring?" asked Mr. Brownlow. "I bought them from Mr. and Mrs. Bumble, who had stolen them from the nurse, who had stolen them from Agnes, the dead girl. I've already told you how I threw them into the river." Mr. Brownlow turned to Rose. "I have one more thing to explain," he said to the girl. "I don't know if I have the strength to hear it now," she murmured, "having heard so much already." Mr. Brownlow put his hand under her arm. "You have a great deal of courage, dear child," he said kindly. He turned to Monks. "Do you know this young lady, sir?" "Yes." "I don't know you," said Rose faintly. "The father of poor Agnes had 2 daughters," said Mr. Brownlow. "What happened to the other one, who was only a young child at the time?" "When Agnes disappeared," replied Monks, "her father changed his name and moved to a lonely place in Wales where no one would know about the family shame. He died very soon afterwards, and this young daughter was taken in by some poor people. My mother hated Agnes and everybody connected with her. She hunted for this young sister and made sure that her life would be unhappy. She told the poor people who had taken her in that the girl was illegitimate and that she came from a bad family with an evil reputation. So the child led a life of miserable poverty, until Mrs. Maylie saw her by chance, pitied her, and took her home. "And do you see this young sister now?" asked Mr. Brownlow. "Yes, standing by your side." Rose could hardly speak. "So Oliver is my nephew?" "I can never call you aunt," cried Oliver. "You'll always be my own dear sister." They ran into each other's arms, both of them crying in their happiness. A father, sister, and mother had been lost and gained, and it was too much for one evening. They stood for a long time in silence, and the others left them alone. The court was full of faces. From every corner all eyes were on one man, Fagin. In front of him, behind, above, below, he seemed surrounded by staring eyes. Not one of the faces showed any sympathy towards him. All were determined that he should hang. At last there was a cry of "Silence!" and everyone looked towards the door. The jury returned and passed close to Fagin.
He could tell nothing from their faces. They could have been made of stone. Then there was complete stillness, not a whisper, not a breath. Guilty. The whole court rang with a great shout, echoing through all the rooms as the crowd ran out of the building to tell all the people waiting outside. The news was that he would die on Monday. Fagin thought of nothing but death that night. He began to remember all the people he had ever known who had been hanged. He could hardly count them. They might have sat in the same prison cell as he was now. He thought about death by hanging, the rope, the cloth bag over the head, the sudden change from strong men to bundles of clothes hanging at the end of a rope. As his last night came, despair seized Fagin's evil soul. He could not sit still, and hurried up and down his small cell, gasping with terror, his eyes flashing with hate and anger. Then he lay trembling on his stone bed and listened to the clock striking the hours. Where would he be when those hours came round again? In the middle of that Sunday night, Mr. Brownlow and Oliver were allowed to enter the prison. Several strong doors were unlocked, and eventually they entered Fagin's cell. The old robber was sitting on the bed, whispering to himself, his face more like a trapped animal's than a human's. "You have some papers, Fagin," said Mr. Brownlow quietly, "which were given to you by monks to look after." "It's a lie," replied Fagin, not looking at him. "I haven't got any." "For the love of God," said Mr. Brownlow very seriously, "don't lie to us now, on the night before your death. You know that Sykes is dead and Monks has confessed. Where are the papers?" "I'll tell you, Oliver," said Fagin. "Come here." He whispered to him. "They're in a bag up the chimney in the front room at the top of the house. But I want to talk to you, my dear." "Yes," said Oliver. "Will you pray with me?" "Outside, outside," said Fagin, pushing the boy in front of him towards the door. "Say I've gone to sleep. They'll believe you. You can take me out with you when you go." The old man's eyes shone with a mad light. "It's no good," said Mr. Brownlow, taking Oliver's hand. "He's gone too far, and we can never reach him now." The cell door opened, and as the visitors left, Fagin started struggling and fighting with his guards, screaming so loudly that the prison walls rang with the sound. They left the prison building in the grey light of dawn. Outside in the street, huge crowds were already gathering, joking and laughing and pushing to get the best places near the great black platform where the rope hung ready for its morning's work. Less than 3 months later, Rose married Harry Maylie. For her sake, Harry had abandoned his political ambitions and had become a simple man of the church. There was no longer any mystery about Rose's birth, but even if there had been, Harry would not have cared. They lived next to the church in a peaceful village. Mrs. Maylie went to live with them and spent the rest of her days in quiet contentment. Mr. Brownlow adopted Oliver as his son. They moved to a house in the same quiet village and were just as happy. Dr. Losburn discovered suddenly that the air in Chertsey did not suit him. In less than 3 months he too had moved to a cottage just outside the village, where he took up gardening and fishing with great energy and enthusiasm. Mr. Brownlow suggested that half the remaining money from the will should be given to Monks and the other half to Oliver, although by law it should all have gone to Oliver alone. Oliver was glad to accept the suggestion. Monks went off with his money to the other side of the world, where he spent it quickly and was soon in prison for another act of fraud. In prison, he became ill and died.
The remaining members of Fagin's gang died in similar ways in other distant countries, all except Charlie Bates, who turned his back on his past life of crime and lived honestly as a farmer. Noah Claypole was given a free pardon for telling the police about Fagin. He soon became employed as an informer for the police, spying on people and telling the police about anyone who had broken the law. Mr. and Mrs. Bumble lost their jobs and became poorer and poorer, eventually living in poverty in the same workhouse that they had once managed. In that quiet country village, the years passed peacefully. Mr. Brownlow filled the mind of his adopted son with knowledge, and as he watched the boy grow up, he was reminded more and more of his old friend, Oliver's father. The two orphans, Rose and Oliver, led lives that were truly happy. The hardships that they had once suffered had left no bitterness in their gentle souls, and all their lives they showed the mercy and kindness to others that God himself shows to all things that